series on creative financing, where we discuss buying investment real estate using other people's money. Today, we're going to talk about the most common and costly mistakes that investors, especially new ones, make when doing their deal analysis. The topic for this presentation came to me a few days ago when a new investor sent me an email. They were all excited about a fourplex they had found and wanted to be an investor or partner in the deal. Unfortunately, when I looked at their numbers and their analysis, I found that they had made most of the common mistakes that new investors make. So let's look at them. The first and most significant mistake that most investors make is not including proper assumptions in their numbers for interest rate fluctuations, vacancy, management, and maintenance. Typically, investors will use the current interest rate as the rate when determining their debt service costs. They never account for the fact that there may be higher interest rates when it comes time to renew. Personally, I always use the greater of 5% or the current 5-year posted fixed rate plus 2% in all my debt service calculations. It gives me the buffer that I need in the event that rates go up. The second problem is that they listen to the vendor or their agent tell them that vacancy is not an issue, that the building is always full. In reality, experienced investors know that vacancy is an issue, and all numbers should include vacancy equivalent to the greater of 5% or the CMHC posted rate for that city, whichever is greater. That is what the lender is going to use when they determine what they're going to lend you for your mortgage. So if it's good enough for the lender, it should be good enough for you as well. The next problem is that investors don't account for the cost to manage the property. They talk about managing it themselves and not using a property manager. But even if they do that, there are costs associated with that. You're not going to work for free, are you? I know I don't. The next cost that's not accounted for properly is maintenance. Maintenance costs are always higher than budgeted for. Personally, in my numbers, I look at the age of the building. And if the building is under 15 years old, I use 5% of my income as a base maintenance cost. If the building is between 15 and 30 years old, I use 10% of my income. And if the building is over 30 years old, I use 15%. Then I'll adjust that maintenance cost by anything that we find in the inspection report. The next problem is that investors tend to rely on what we call pro forma financials provided by the agent or vendor. These usually include expenses only for property tax, insurance, and sometimes some utilities. Experienced investors know that there are a lot more costs than that in order to manage and run a building. So make sure that you get a proper accounting of the expenses when doing your numbers. Next, investors tend to look at the potential rents that can be derived from the market or the market rents. Really, they should be using the actual rents that are being collected. It can be difficult once you own a property to increase rents. There are properties under rent control, and it may be difficult to change tenants. So it's important that you use actual rents in the income calculations. The next problem is that investors tend to like counting on appreciation to offset poor or negative cash flow. Appreciation is an assumption about something that will happen in the future. And while it's almost certain that we will get some appreciation over time, we cannot count on that. And it's important to not use that to offset bad cash flow. You can be profitable on paper and still go bankrupt. Next, most investors neglect the tenant profile in the area that they're looking to invest. They don't account for the fact that some tenants are going to stop paying rent, and they ignore the turnover rate in the area of the city. All cities have different areas. You have higher income areas, you have working class areas, you have downtown, you have the suburbs. Each of these have different tenant profiles and different turnover rates. The next problem is that investors tend to underestimate the cost of repairs and vacancy between tenants. We just talked about tenant profile. This particular property that the new investor was looking at had 3 one-bedrooms and 1 two-bedroom. One-bedroom apartments tend to turn over more often than 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom apartments. Typically, you lose 1 month's rent for vacancy between tenants. If you're in a 1-bedroom apartment in a working class area, you tend to have turnover about once a year. Well, 1 vacant unit month per year is already an 8% vacancy rate. It's very important to properly account for vacancy between tenants. Also, we're going to be doing painting and minor repairs. There are costs associated with this. Always assume a base amount as part of your numbers. Next, we tend to accept current insurance and property tax as reported by the vendor. They're going to have slips, they're going to have receipts, they're going to be able to show you what their taxes and insurance are. Unfortunately, when a property changes hands, these tend to change as well. In the case of our fourplex, the vendor had owned the property for 25 years. His assessment was lower than it would be after it has changed hands. What that means is that property taxes are likely going to go up as part of the turnover of the property or within a couple of years. He had also used the same insurance company for the last 15. Typically, applying for new insurance is going to be more costly. You should always get an insurance quote and include that in your numbers. So all of this we can round up by saying investors tend to make assumptions and not verify them. Now we all know that ASSUME is an acronym, and it stands for making an ass out of you and me. So very important. Never accept assumptions. Always verify. I like to quote Warren Buffett. He says, it's good to learn from your mistakes, but it's even better to learn from the mistakes of others. Hopefully this presentation has given you some insight into typical mistakes that are made by investors and that can be very costly.